October 1941. The Western Desert, 20 miles south of Alexandria. A German Fiesler-Storch reconnaissance aircraft banks low over the sand, its observer scanning the Earth through Zeiss binoculars. Below, the British positions stretch across the horizon, neat rows of armored vehicles, supply dumps stacked with crates, artillery batteries dug into protective revetments. The observer marks the coordinates carefully. Hundreds of tanks. Thousands of men. An entire armored division where British intelligence intercepts suggested only a skeleton force. The pilot throttles up, turning back toward Axis lines. Neither man realizes they've just photographed shadows. The tanks below are canvas and timber. The supply dumps are empty crates arranged by theatrical set designers. The artillery pieces are painted logs mounted on truck chassis. What appears to be a formidable concentration of British armor is, in reality, the work of one man, a London stage magician named Jasper Maskelyne, and his team of illusionists, carpenters, and artists who've turned the principles of grand theatrical deception into a weapon of war. This is the story of how inflatable tanks and painted canvas became instruments of strategic deception, and how a conjurer's toy army helped fool the Desert Fox himself. If you want to see how canvas and paint defeated Real Steel, hit that subscribe button. We're about to reveal the greatest magic trick of World War II. The war in North Africa had become Britain's most critical theater by the summer of 1940. With France fallen and the Luftwaffe hammering British cities, the desert campaigns in Egypt and Libya represented the only front where British Commonwealth forces could directly engage Axis ground troops. Control of the Suez Canal, the Empire's lifeline to oil, reinforcements, and communication with India and the Far East, hung in the balance. Italy's entry into the war in June 1940 had immediately threatened this strategic artery. Mussolini's forces in Libya, numbering over 250,000 men under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, faced a British and Commonwealth force in Egypt of barely 36,000 troops under General Archibald Wavell. The mathematical disadvantage was severe. Yet Wavell understood something his Italian opponent did not. In desert warfare, perception often mattered more than reality. The Western Desert was a reconnaissance officer's nightmare and an illusionist's dream. Vast, featureless expanses of sand and rock stretched for hundreds of miles, punctuated only by occasional wadis and escarpments. Ground observation was limited to a few thousand yards at best. This meant both sides relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance, aircraft that photographed positions, counted vehicles, and reported concentrations of force. What the camera saw became operational truth. By December 1940, Wavell's forces had launched Operation Compass, a limited offensive that transformed into a stunning victory. British and Australian troops routed 10 Italian divisions, capturing 130,000 prisoners and advancing 500 miles in 2 months. But this triumph contained the seeds of future vulnerability. Berlin could not ignore the collapse of its Axis partner. In February 1941, Adolf Hitler dispatched General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel to Libya with a newly formed Afrika Korps, initially just 2 divisions, but commanded by one of Germany's most aggressive and tactically brilliant officers. Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, and within weeks had launched attacks that violated his explicit orders to remain defensive. By April, he'd retaken most of what Italy had lost, besieged the port of Tobruk, and pushed British forces back to the Egyptian frontier. The Desert Fox, as Rommel would become known, had demonstrated a mastery of mobile warfare that repeatedly caught British commanders off guard. His reconnaissance units were superior, his response times faster, his willingness to take risks unmatched. For British commanders in Cairo, the situation had become desperate. Wavell's forces were stretched impossibly thin, fighting in East Africa, Iraq, and Syria simultaneously while trying to contain Rommel. Churchill demanded offensive action. The war cabinet needed victories. But the mathematics remained brutal. Rommel's Afrika Korps and Italian allies could field approximately 90,000 men and 400 tanks by mid-1941, while British forces in forward positions numbered perhaps 70,000 with inferior tank designs. In this context, a radical idea began to circulate through British military intelligence. If you couldn't match the enemy in steel, perhaps you could deceive him about where that steel was positioned. The concept wasn't entirely new. The Great War had seen dummy trenches and camouflaged positions, but the scale and sophistication required for desert warfare demanded something unprecedented. Enter Colonel Dudley Clark, a staff officer with an unconventional mind and a talent for what the British military euphemistically called special means. In December 1940, Clark had been tasked with establishing a new organization designated simply as A-Force. Its official purpose was coordination of Allied special operations in the Middle East. Its real mission was strategic deception. Clark understood that deception in the desert required physical credibility. German reconnaissance pilots weren't fools. They needed to see actual objects, cast actual shadows, leave actual tracks in the sand. But building thousands of dummy tanks and guns from scratch required resources Britain didn't have. What Clark needed was someone who understood the art of making illusions appear real from a distance. He needed a magician. Jasper Maskelyne arrived in Egypt in March 1941 as a 38-year-old gunner in the Royal Engineers, though his real expertise had nothing to do with conventional military engineering. He was the third generation of Britain's most famous family of stage magicians. His grandfather, John Neville Maskelyne, had co-founded the legendary Egyptian Hall in London, where he'd exposed fraudulent spiritualists and pioneered theatrical illusions. His father, Neville, had continued the tradition. Jasper had grown up backstage, learning the mechanics of misdirection, forced perspective, and audience manipulation. When war broke out in 1939, Maskelyne had volunteered immediately, convinced his skills could serve Britain's cause. He'd spent months trying to persuade the War Office that stage magic had military applications, that the same techniques used to make elephants disappear on stage could hide artillery batteries from enemy observation. The bureaucrats in London had been skeptical. But in the desperate atmosphere of Cairo in 1941, Colonel Clark was willing to listen to anyone with unconventional ideas. Clark interviewed Maskelyne personally in late March 1941. According to Maskelyne's own post-war accounts, he demonstrated basic principles: how forced perspective could make small objects appear large, how paint and canvas could simulate metal and shadow, how understanding human perception could exploit the limitations of aerial photography. Clark was intrigued. By April, Maskelyne had been assigned to the newly formed Camouflage Experimental Section, working under Major Geoffrey Barkas, a film director turned military camouflage officer. The team Maskelyne assembled became known informally as the Magic Gang, a deliberately theatrical nickname that both celebrated and concealed their actual work. The core group included approximately 14 men, carpenters from British film studios, commercial artists, an architectural designer, and even a chemical engineer. Among them was Bill Robson, a carpenter who'd built sets for Alexander Korda's London films. There was Frank Riseborough, who designed shop displays for Selfridges. These were men who understood how to create convincing illusions on tight budgets and impossible deadlines. Their first workshop was established in a requisitioned building near Cairo, mockingly dubbed the Magic Factory. Here, working with whatever materials they could scrounge, canvas from old tents, timber from packing crates, wire from demolished buildings, they began experimenting with dummy equipment. The challenge was creating objects that would fool German aerial reconnaissance from 3,000 to 10,000 feet while being light enough for small teams to deploy quickly in the field. Early experiments focused on sun shields, collapsible canvas covers that could make a tank resemble a truck when viewed from above. The principle was simple. German reconnaissance pilots expected to see logistics vehicles near the front lines, but combat vehicles would trigger alerts. By disguising tanks as trucks during daylight moves, British forces could reposition armor without revealing their intentions. Tests conducted in May 1941 showed the concept worked, if the execution was precise. But Maskelyne and his team quickly understood they needed to go further. It wasn't enough to hide real equipment. They needed to create entirely fictional forces, phantom divisions that would draw German attention away from actual British concentrations. This required manufacturing hundreds, eventually thousands, of dummy vehicles convincing enough to survive close scrutiny by enemy reconnaissance. The breakthrough came with the development of inflatable tanks. Working with engineers from the Royal Engineers, the Magic Gang designed collapsible frameworks covered with rubberized canvas that could be inflated using foot pumps or small compressors. A four-man team could erect a dummy Grant tank in approximately 20 minutes. From 5,000 feet, the altitude of most German tactical reconnaissance, the dummies cast shadows identical to real armor, showed appropriate track patterns when positioned correctly, and even included painted details like turret markings and unit insignia. Production began in earnest by July 1941. Small workshops across Cairo and Alexandria were contracted to manufacture components. By September, A-Force had accumulated approximately 250 dummy tanks, 200 dummy artillery pieces, and countless fake supply dumps and vehicle parks. But hardware alone wasn't enough. The deception required choreography. This meant understanding German intelligence procedures. A force analyzed captured reconnaissance photographs and interrogated German prisoners to determine exactly what visual cues triggered axis assessments of British strength. They learned that German photo interpreters looked for specific patterns: tank formations in standard British tactical groupings, artillery positioned in battery arrangements, supply dumps with consistent spacing and organization, vehicle track patterns indicating movement and habitation. Maskelyne's theatrical training proved invaluable here. He understood that a convincing illusion required consistency across multiple sensory channels. Dummy positions needed not just visual credibility but behavioral credibility. This meant fake radio traffic transmitted from phantom units. It meant actual vehicles driving circuits around dummy positions to create realistic track patterns. It meant carefully timed smoke from cooking fires and latrines dug in appropriate positions. Every detail reinforced the illusion that thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles occupied positions that were, in reality, defended by skeleton crews and canvas props. By October 1941, the Magic Gang had conducted successful field trials. Dummy positions had fooled British reconnaissance pilots who'd been briefed to look for fakes. German aerial photographs captured by intelligence services showed that Axis analysts were consistently identifying dummy concentrations as real formations. The stage was set for operational deployment. But the real test would come a year later, in the most crucial deception operation of the North African campaign, when British survival would depend on convincing Rommel that Montgomery's massive armored thrust at El Alamein would come from the south, when in reality it would smash through from the north. German intelligence in North Africa operated under a fundamental psychological vulnerability: confirmation bias reinforced by operational doctrine. Rommel's headquarters staff, particularly the intelligence section under Major F.W. von Mellenthin, had developed sophisticated methods for analyzing British formations based on radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance. But this sophistication created blind spots. German analysts expected British armor to behave according to established patterns, concentrating in specific terrain, deploying in standard brigade formations, positioning supply dumps at predictable intervals behind the front. The Magic Gang exploited this expectation ruthlessly. When creating phantom divisions, they didn't simply scatter dummy tanks randomly across the desert. They positioned them according to British tactical doctrine as it appeared in captured training manuals. Dummy supply dumps were placed exactly where German planning staff would expect them based on calculated logistics ranges. Fake artillery batteries occupied positions that matched British gunnery practice. The deception worked because it told the Germans exactly what they already believed they knew about British operational behavior. By August 1942, A Force had refined this psychological exploitation to extraordinary precision. Analysis of German situation reports, obtained through ultra-intercepts of encrypted communications, showed that Rommel's staff consistently overestimated British armor strength in sectors where dummy concentrations had been deployed. In one instance documented in September 1942, German intelligence assessed the British 10th Armored Division as being positioned in the southern sector near Heimamat, when the Real Division was actually 40 miles north. The Germans were seeing what Maskelyne wanted them to see, and interpreting it through the lens of their own doctrinal expectations. The technical challenge of creating thousands of convincing dummies under desert conditions required innovation that went far beyond stage magic. The Magic Gang's workshops operated as a bizarre hybrid of theater prop department and military factory. By mid-1942, production had been systematized across multiple facilities. Canvas shops in Cairo produced the rubberized fabric skins, metal workshops fabricated the collapsible framework poles, and paint shops mixed specialized pigments that would maintain color accuracy under the harsh desert sun. The dummy tanks evolved through multiple iterations. Early models used simple tubular frameworks that proved too fragile for field deployment. By early 1942, the design had shifted to a sophisticated system using telescoping aluminum poles, lightweight enough for man-portable deployment but rigid enough to maintain shape under wind stress. The canvas skins were treated with chemical compounds that reduced glare and prevented the fabric from bleaching to unnatural colors. Detail painting included simulated wear patterns, unit markings copied from actual British armor, and even fake damage that suggested vehicles had seen combat. But the most ingenious element was the sunshield system used in reverse. Real tanks could be disguised as trucks during repositioning, while simultaneously, trucks in the new positions could be disguised as tanks. This allowed British commanders to shift entire armored brigades from one sector to another over the course of several nights, with German reconnaissance believing the armor had never moved. The technical execution required precise timing. Sun shields went onto real tanks at dusk, convoys moved through darkness, dummy tanks were erected in the vacated positions before dawn, and sun shields came off the real tanks in their new positions only after dummy trucks had been positioned there first. By October 1942, the inventory managed by A Force included approximately 600 dummy tanks, 400 dummy artillery pieces, 2,000 dummy vehicles of various types, and material for constructing fake supply dumps covering several square miles. The scale had transformed from theatrical prop-making into something approaching industrial production, with quality control standards that would have been recognizable to any military contractor. The men of the Magic Gang occupied a peculiar space in the military hierarchy. They were soldiers, subject to military discipline and often working under shellfire, yet their skills came from civilian creative industries that valued improvisation and artistic judgment. This created constant friction with conventional military thinking, but also generated innovations that rigid hierarchies would never have produced. Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Barkas, the film director who commanded the camouflage operations, understood that creativity couldn't be commanded. His workshop operated more like a film production than a military unit. Men were encouraged to suggest improvements, experiment with materials, and challenge designs that weren't working. Frank Riseborough, the former shop designer, developed the technique of using crushed glass mixed with paint to simulate the metallic sheen of tank armor when photographed at certain angles. Bill Robson invented a quick deployment system for dummy artillery that reduced setup time from 45 minutes to under 15 minutes, a crucial improvement when working in exposed forward positions. But the work was far from safe. Dummy positions needed to be maintained even under artillery fire and air attack. Abandoning them too quickly would reveal the deception. In July 1942, 2 members of the camouflage section were killed by German shellfire while repairing dummy positions near El Alamein. Their deaths illustrated the bizarre nature of their service. Killed while defending illusions, casualties in a war of perception where canvas and paint had become as strategically important as steel and explosives. Erwin Rommel's reputation as a tactical genius was well-deserved, but his intelligence apparatus suffered from structural weaknesses that made it surprisingly susceptible to deception. The Africa Corps Intelligence Section, despite its professionalism, relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance because other intelligence sources had proven unreliable. German signals intelligence in North Africa was limited. British radio security had improved significantly by 1942, making traffic analysis less productive. Agent networks were virtually non-existent. The Arab population proved largely uninterested in serving either side, and British counterintelligence had successfully neutralized most Axis espionage attempts. This left aerial photography as the primary intelligence source, and here German capabilities were both sophisticated and limited. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance squadrons operating in North Africa, primarily Aufklärungsgruppe 14 and elements of Aufklärungsstaffel 2, H/14, flew excellent aircraft including the high-altitude Junkers Ju-86P and the nimble Messerschmitt Bf-110. Pilots were experienced and photo interpreters highly trained. But photographic intelligence has an inherent weakness. It shows only what exists at the moment of exposure, and interpretation depends on analyst assumptions. Major von Mellenthin, Rommel's intelligence chief, compiled daily situation reports based primarily on reconnaissance photographs supplemented by prisoner interrogations and document captures. His assessments were generally accurate regarding British positions and unit identifications. But the system had no reliable method for distinguishing real equipment from sophisticated dummies when viewed from 5,000 feet. German doctrine assumed that the resource cost of building convincing dummies made large-scale deception economically impractical. This assumption was wrong. The Magic Gang's dummy tank cost approximately £15 to manufacture, while a real Grant tank cost £8,000. The return on investment in deception was staggering. By September 1942, ultra-intercepts revealed that German intelligence consistently overestimated British armor strength by 30 to 40% in sectors where A Force had deployed dummy concentrations. Rommel's staff believed the British had approximately 600 tanks available for the coming battle. The actual figure was closer to 1,100, but positioned in entirely different sectors than German intelligence predicted. Operation Bertram represented the culmination of 2 years of deception refinement, a comprehensive plan to mislead Rommel about the location, timing, and weight of Montgomery's offensive at El Alamein. Conceived in August 1942 and executed through October, Bertram was perhaps the most ambitious tactical deception of World War II, coordinating dummy forces, concealment operations, and electromagnetic deception across a 40-mile front. The core concept was elegant. Make Rommel believe the main British attack would come in the south near Heimamat, launched no earlier than early November, while the real assault would smash through northern positions on October 23. This required two simultaneous deceptions. In the north, the actual buildup of XXX Corps, including over 600 tanks and supporting artillery, had to be hidden. In the south, a phantom buildup of equal or greater size had to appear convincing. The northern concealment used sun shields on a massive scale. As real tanks moved into forward assembly areas south of Tel El Isa, they were immediately covered with truck disguise canopies. Simultaneously, dummy trucks were positioned in rear areas, maintaining the appearance that logistics vehicles remained in their normal positions. The timing was surgical. Tanks moved only at night, sun shields were fitted before dawn, and British vehicles already in the area were carefully arranged to obscure gaps in the deception. In the south, the Magic Gang erected an entire phantom armored corps over 6 weeks. Starting in early September, dummy tanks began appearing in brigade strength concentrations near Samaket Gabala. By mid-October, German reconnaissance photographed what appeared to be approximately 150 tanks, multiple artillery batteries, and a logistics infrastructure indicating a major formation preparing for offensive operations. Every element was choreographed. Radio traffic from actual signals units mimicked divisional command networks. Small detachments of real vehicles drove patterns around the dummy positions, creating appropriate track patterns, and cooking fires were lit at times matching British routine orders. The deception even extended to logistics infrastructure. A dummy water pipeline was constructed extending south from the railhead at Samaket Gabala, complete with pumping stations and water storage tanks, all non-functional but visible from aerial reconnaissance. German intelligence staff, knowing that water supply dictated offensive capability in the desert, used the pipeline as evidence that British preparations in the south wouldn't be complete until early November. The real water pipeline serving the northern assault forces was buried and its construction concealed by constant traffic over the excavation routes. Despite its successes, the deception program operated under constant constraints and carried significant risks. The primary limitation was sustainability. Dummy positions required maintenance crews who could have been used in combat roles. Wind damage, sandstorms, and the harsh desert climate meant that dummy equipment deteriorated rapidly. A single damaged dummy, if photographed by German reconnaissance, could compromise the entire deception by revealing the true nature of surrounding equipment. There was also the risk of overclaiming. Jasper Maskelyne's post-war accounts, particularly his 1949 memoir, Magic, Top Secret, attributed nearly supernatural influence to the Magic Gang, claiming they'd concealed the Suez Canal with spinning mirrors and hidden entire harbors. These exaggerated claims created tensions with other deception personnel. Colonel Dudley Clark and Major Barkas both noted in post-war reports that Maskelyne's role, while valuable, was one component of a much larger A-Force operation involving signals deception, naval feints, and strategic intelligence operations. The mathematical reality was that deception could multiply effectiveness but couldn't replace actual combat power. At El Alamein, Montgomery assembled genuine material superiority. 1,029 tanks against Rommel's 547, including only 278 German panzers, with the rest being inferior Italian models. British artillery numbered 908 guns against 552 Axis pieces. The 8th Army had 195,000 men against approximately 104,000 Axis troops, many Italian divisions already demoralized by years of desert warfare. What the deception achieved wasn't victory from weakness, but the ability to concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point without Rommel recognizing the danger until too late. It bought Montgomery the crucial element of surprise that turned numerical superiority into tactical devastation. The dummy tanks didn't defeat the Afrika Korps, the real tanks did. But the dummies ensured those real tanks hit exactly where Rommel wasn't prepared to stop them. October 23, 1942. 2,140 hours. El Alamein. The silence across the northern sector was unnatural. For 3 months, this stretch of desert had seen constant patrol activity, occasional artillery duels, and the grinding routine of static warfare. Now, in the gathering darkness, nearly 1,000 British and Commonwealth guns stood ready along a 40-mile front, their crews waiting for the signal that would announce the largest artillery barrage the Desert War had yet witnessed. 40 miles to the south, near Heimamat, German observation posts watched phantom British preparations continue. Reconnaissance photographs from that afternoon had shown increased activity around the dummy armored concentrations, dust clouds suggesting vehicle movement, communications traffic indicating headquarters activity, all the signatures of a formation nearing operational readiness. Major von Mellenthin's latest intelligence summary, distributed to Africa Corps commanders that morning, assessed the main British attack would come from the southern sector, probably within 10 to 14 days. The enemy, German intelligence concluded, was still preparing. They were wrong. At precisely 2,140 hours, 882 British guns opened fire simultaneously across the northern front. The barrage was overwhelming. Over 500 rounds per gun fired in the opening 20 minutes, a sustained rate of fire that turned the night sky amber and sent shockwaves rippling across the desert floor. The targets were precise: German and Italian artillery positions, command posts, communication centers, and defensive strongpoints, all carefully mapped during weeks of reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation. The sound was apocalyptic. Soldiers 15 miles from the front lines reported the ground shaking beneath their feet. The concussion could be felt in Alexandria, 60 miles to the east. For the Axis defenders in forward positions, primarily Italian infantry divisions including the Trento, Bologna, and Brescia divisions, the bombardment created instant chaos. Communications were severed, command posts obliterated, defensive positions collapsed by direct hits or buried under cascading sand. At 2,200 hours, 20 minutes into the barrage, the infantry assault began. 4 infantry divisions of XXX Corps, the 9th Australian, 51st Highland, 2nd New Zealand, and 1st South African, advanced through the darkness behind mine-clearing teams equipped with the newly developed Scorpion flail tanks and Polish mine detectors. Their objective was to breach 2 massive minefields. The Germans had planted over 500,000 mines in the El Alamein defenses, and create corridors through which British armor could pass. The infantry advance was methodical, almost mechanical in its precision. Soldiers moved behind creeping artillery barrages that lifted 100 yards every 3 minutes. Behind them, engineers marked cleared lanes through the minefields with white tape and oil lamps, creating paths named sun, moon, and star routes. The planning had been exhaustive. Montgomery's staff had rehearsed every phase behind British lines using full-scale models of German positions. For Rommel, the attack came at the worst possible moment, and from the worst possible direction. He was in Germany on medical leave, suffering from exhaustion and chronic stomach ailments. His replacement, General George Stumm, had arrived only 3 weeks earlier and lacked detailed knowledge of the front. When the British barrage began, Stumm was at his headquarters near Tel El Issa. He immediately drove forward to assess the situation personally, a decision that would prove fatal. At approximately 0700 hours on October 24th, Stumm's staff car came under fire from Australian positions near Hill 28. His driver was killed instantly. Stumm, attempting to dismount while the vehicle was still moving, either suffered a heart attack or was struck by fragments. Accounts vary. His body fell from the vehicle and lay undiscovered in the desert for nearly 24 hours. The Africa Corps, at the crisis moment of the British offensive, was effectively leaderless. German forward units fought with characteristic tenacity despite the shock. Elements of the 164th Light Division and Italian Littorio Division launched immediate counterattacks against the Scottish penetrations. German 88mm anti-tank guns, the most feared weapons in the desert, extracted heavy casualties from British armor attempting to push through the cleared lanes. But the confusion created by Operation Bertram was producing exactly the effect A Force had designed. German reserves, particularly the 21st Panzer Division positioned in the south, remained in place, waiting for the attack von Mellenthin's intelligence had predicted would come from that sector. Throughout the night of October 23rd to 24th, German situation reports remained fixated on the dummy concentrations near Heimamat. Radio intercepts suggested British formations there were preparing to move. Reconnaissance had shown extensive armor. Doctrine dictated that reserves shouldn't be committed piecemeal to what might be a diversionary attack in the north. This paralysis was precisely what Montgomery had calculated. His real striking force, X-Corps with over 500 tanks including the new American-built Sherman M4S, was already moving through the infantry-cleared corridors, positioning for the breakout that would destroy Axis defensive coherence. The dummy tanks in the south had accomplished their mission. They'd frozen German reserves in position during the critical 12 hours when British armor needed to concentrate unmolested. By dawn on October 24th, The scope of the deception became horrifyingly clear to surviving German commanders. British armor strength in the northern sector far exceeded intelligence estimates. The positions were not where reconnaissance had indicated. The attack had come days earlier than predicted. And Rommel, the one commander who might have improvised a response, was still in Germany, racing to return to Africa as his command structure collapsed. October 25, 1942. Rommel's aircraft touched down at Sidi Abd el Rahman airfield at 2100 hours. He'd flown directly from Germany via Rome, abandoning his medical leave the moment he'd received the emergency cables informing him of Stumm's death and the scale of the British offensive. During the flight, he'd reviewed situation reports that grew progressively more alarming. The British had achieved complete surprise in the northern sector. German reserves had been deployed late and piecemeal. Fuel stocks, already critically low, were being consumed in frantic repositioning movements. Italian divisions were disintegrating under sustained artillery bombardment and infantry assault. What stunned Rommel, according to his own war diary entries from late October, was the intelligence failure. German reconnaissance had thoroughly photographed British positions throughout September and early October. Analysis had shown major armor concentrations in the southern sector. Yet the attack had come from the north with force levels that suggested an entire armored corps had materialized seemingly from nowhere. The British had achieved exactly what Rommel himself had done to them repeatedly over 18 months. They'd gotten inside his decision cycle, forced him to react rather than anticipate, and positioned overwhelming force where he was weakest. By October 26, the tactical situation had crystallized into brutal mathematics. Montgomery had committed approximately 1,000 tanks to the northern breakthrough, rotating fresh formations into combat as initial units exhausted their fuel and ammunition. Against this, Rommel could field perhaps 240 operational German panzers. The rest were Italian M13/40S and L3 tankettes that were death traps against British armor. German anti-tank screens were taking heavy casualties but couldn't stop concentrated British assaults backed by artillery superiority of nearly 2-to-1. The dummy positions in the south remained operational throughout this period, maintained by small detachments who continued the deception even as real combat raged 40 miles north. German reconnaissance continued photographing them, unable to distinguish the canvas facades from genuine equipment. On October 27, a Luftwaffe situation report noted that British armor concentrations near Heimamat appeared to be preparing for movement northward, presumably to reinforce the breakthrough. In reality, those concentrations consisted of approximately 150 inflatable tanks, their frameworks held rigid by desert wind, their painted shadows falling convincingly across the sand. The psychological impact of the deception extended beyond initial deployment confusion. As German commanders realized they'd been systematically misled, doubt began eroding confidence in all intelligence assessments. If British armor strength had been underestimated so drastically, what else was wrong? Were the forces in the north stronger than current estimates? Could there be additional hidden reserves? This uncertainty made defensive planning nearly impossible and reinforced cautious reactions when aggressive counterattacks might have disrupted British momentum. November 2, 1942. The decisive breakthrough came at Tel El Akakar. Montgomery had spent 10 days grinding through German defensive positions, accepting heavy casualties but maintaining relentless pressure. British tactics had evolved into systematic destruction, artillery bombardments that lasted hours, infantry assaults that cleared strongpoints, armor exploitation that prevented German forces from establishing new defensive lines. By November 1, Rommel's front was fracturing. Fuel shortages prevented coordinated movement. Italian units were surrendering en masse. The Africa Corps was being methodically dismantled. At 0105 hours on November 2, Operation Supercharge began, Montgomery's final knockout blow. The 2nd New Zealand Division, reinforced with 2 British armored brigades, struck southwest from the Tel El Akakar area. Behind them came X Corps with over 400 tanks in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough. The objective was to rupture the German line completely and force Rommel into open retreat. The German 21st Panzer Division, which had spent the opening days of the battle positioned south near Heimamat, watching phantom British forces that never attacked, threw itself into desperate counterattacks against the breakthrough. They fought with suicidal courage, German tank crews engaging British armor at point-blank range, sacrificing themselves to buy time for retreating infantry. But the mathematics were impossible. For every British tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. German panzers ran out of fuel mid-battle and were abandoned. Artillery batteries fired until their ammunition was exhausted, then destroyed their guns and retreated on foot. By midday on November 2nd, Rommel's front had collapsed. British armor was in open country west of the minefields. The Afrika Korps was in full retreat toward Fuca, abandoning equipment it couldn't move, leaving behind thousands of Italian soldiers who lacked transport. The Desert Fox, who'd humiliated British commanders from Wavell to Auchinleck, who'd come within 60 miles of Alexandria, who'd seemed invincible in mobile desert warfare, was running for his military life. The illusion that had begun with canvas and paint, with the careful work of stage magicians and film carpenters, had held long enough for Montgomery to position overwhelming force at the decisive point. The dummy tanks hadn't fired a shot, but they'd achieved something perhaps more valuable. They'd convinced Rommel to look the wrong direction at the critical moment. In warfare, that split second of confusion, that hesitation before committing reserves, can mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. For the Afrika Korps, the catastrophe was complete. The Phantom Division created by Maskelyne's Magic Gang had accomplished its mission not through firepower, but through deception so convincing that it paralyzed enemy decision-making when decisions mattered most. The toy army had helped destroy a real one. November 4, 1942. The pursuit began. Rommel's retreat from El Alamein evolved rapidly from organized withdrawal into chaotic flight. The Afrika Korps, once the embodiment of mobile warfare excellence, was now desperately trying to escape encirclement. British armor pushed west along the coast road, harrying German rearguards and capturing supply dumps that Rommel couldn't evacuate. The Luftwaffe, hampered by fuel shortages and RAF superiority, could provide only sporadic cover. Italian divisions, lacking motorized transport, surrendered by the thousands or scattered into the desert where they died of thirst and exposure. The casualty figures told the story of a disaster. By November 11th, when the pursuing British forces captured the key supply base at Tobruk, Axis losses at El Alamein totaled approximately 30,000 dead and wounded, with another 30,000 captured, primarily Italians from divisions like the Trento and Bologna that had been overrun in the opening bombardment. German casualties were proportionally lower but strategically catastrophic. The Afrika Korps had lost approximately 1,100 dead, 3,900 wounded, and 7,900 captured, but more critically, it had lost over 450 tanks and nearly 1,000 artillery pieces, equipment Germany could barely replace given simultaneous demands on the Eastern Front. British and Commonwealth casualties were severe but sustainable. Montgomery's forces suffered approximately 13,500 casualties, 2,350 killed, 8,950 wounded, and 2,260 missing. Tank losses were heavy, approximately 500 armored vehicles destroyed or damaged, but British logistics and American Lend-Lease meant replacement tanks were already arriving at Alexandria and Port Said. The industrial arithmetic of 1942 favored the Allies increasingly, and El Alamein had demonstrated that British commanders had finally learned to leverage that advantage effectively. But how much credit belonged to Operation Bertram? Post-war analysis by both British and German officers attempted to quantify deception's contribution to victory. Rommel himself, in his collected papers edited and published after his death, noted that British deception regarding the location and timing of the attack had been complete and had fatally delayed his deployment of armored reserves. Major von Mellenthin, in his post-war memoir Panzer Battles, acknowledged that German intelligence had been comprehensively misled about British dispositions, leading to crucial errors in defensive planning. The most detailed assessment came from British post-action reports compiled by A-Force and reviewed by Montgomery's headquarters staff in December 1942. These documents, declassified in the 1970s, concluded that Operation Bertram had achieved four critical effects. First, it had concealed the true scale of British armor concentration in the northern sector, leading German intelligence to underestimate attacking force by approximately 40%. Second, it had convinced Rommel the main attack would come from the south, causing a 24 to 48-hour delay in committing the 21st Panzer Division to the decisive sector. Third, it had persuaded German commanders the attack wouldn't occur until early November, sacrificing operational security for surprise when Montgomery struck on October 23. Fourth, it had degraded German confidence in their intelligence apparatus during the battle, creating hesitation at critical decision points. Quantifying these effects in terms of casualties prevented or days saved was impossible, but the consensus among British planners was that Bertram had potentially shortened the battle by 3 to 5 days and reduced British casualties by 20 to 30%, thousands of lives saved by canvas and paint, by careful staging and psychological exploitation. Montgomery himself, never generous with praise for subordinates, wrote in his memoirs that the deception had been brilliantly executed and had contributed materially to the victory. Yet the aftermath also revealed tensions within the deception apparatus. Jasper Maskelyne, in newspaper interviews given immediately after the battle became public, began claiming primary credit for British success. Articles appeared in British papers describing him as the magician who fooled Rommel and attributing near-supernatural capabilities to his work. These claims infuriated other members of A Force, particularly Colonel Dudley Clark and Major Geoffrey Barkas, who understood that Operation Bertram had been a coordinated effort involving signals deception, naval feints, and strategic intelligence operations far beyond the Magic Gang's dummy equipment. The dispute escalated through late 1942 and into 1943. Clark, in internal memoranda, noted acidly that Maskelyne had been one technician among many, and that his theatrical background, while useful, didn't justify his claims of having personally designed and executed the entire deception. Barkas, even more bluntly, wrote that Maskelyne's ego had become detrimental to operational security and recommended his transfer out of the deception unit. By March 1943, the Magic Gang had effectively disbanded. Maskelyne was reassigned to training duties in East Africa, removed from operational deception work. The workshops in Cairo continued producing dummy equipment under Barkas's supervision, but the theatrical element that had characterized early operations gave way to more systematized, engineering-focused approaches. The strategic consequences of El Alamein extended far beyond the desert. Churchill, speaking to Parliament on November 10, 1942, declared, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." He was referring not just to Rommel's defeat, but to a fundamental shift in Allied fortunes. For the first time since 1940, British forces had achieved a decisive offensive victory against German troops. The psychological impact across the Commonwealth was immense, proof that German military excellence could be matched and defeated. The timing coincided almost perfectly with Operation Torch, the Allied landings in French North Africa that began on November 8, 1942. American and British forces seized Morocco and Algeria, threatening Rommel's rear and creating a two-front campaign that would eventually trap the Afrika Korps in Tunisia. The convergence was deliberate. Allied strategic planning had coordinated El Alamein with Torch to create maximum disruption of Axis operations. The deception at El Alamein ensured Montgomery's victory came swiftly enough to prevent Rommel from interfering with the Torch landings. For Germany, El Alamein marked the beginning of the end in North Africa, but also revealed deeper strategic miscalculations. Hitler, obsessed with holding territory, ordered Rommel to stand and fight rather than execute a strategic withdrawal that might have preserved the Afrika Korps for defensive operations in Tunisia. This order, issued on November 3 and briefly followed before Rommel disobeyed it, exemplified the rigid thinking that would increasingly characterize German operations as the war turned against them. Rommel himself recognized the futility. His war diary entries from November 1942 show a commander who understood his forces were being systematically destroyed for no strategic gain. The lessons of El Alamein regarding deception were absorbed rapidly by Allied planning staffs. By early 1943, deception planning had become integrated into every major Allied operation. The techniques refined in the desert, dummy equipment, signals deception, coordinated psychological operations, would be scaled up dramatically for Operation Fortitude, the strategic deception preceding D-Day. That operation, which convinced German High Command the Normandy landings were a feint and the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais, employed inflatable tanks and dummy installations on a scale that dwarfed anything attempted in North Africa. The success at El Alamein had proven the concept. Fortitude would perfect it. The institutional legacy was equally significant. A Force continued operations throughout the Mediterranean campaign, conducting deception operations for the invasions of Sicily, Italy, and southern France. The organizational structure Clark had established, combining signals intelligence, physical deception, and psychological operations, became the model for Anglo-American deception units. By 1944, similar organizations existed in every theater of Allied operations, from Burma to Western Europe. Yet the human stories behind the deception remained largely classified until decades after the war. The men of the Magic Gang returned to civilian life with few public honors and strict instructions not to discuss their wartime work. Bill Robson resumed carpentry in London. Frank Riseborough returned to shop design. Many never spoke about their service, even to family members, bound by Official Secrets Act restrictions that remained in force until the 1970s. Jasper Maskelyne's post-war trajectory was more public and more controversial. His 1949 memoir, Magic, Top Secret, made extraordinary claims about his wartime service, including assertions that he'd hidden the Suez Canal using rotating searchlights, concealed Alexandria Harbor with mirrors, and personally designed every aspect of Operation Bertram. British military historians immediately challenged these accounts. Barkas published a rebuttal noting that many of Maskelyne's claimed operations had never occurred or had been conducted by other units. Clark's Official History of A Force, declassified in 1979, devoted several pages to correcting Maskelyne's exaggerations. The truth, as it eventually emerged from declassified documents, was both more modest and more interesting than Maskelyne's theatrical version. He had been an important contributor to camouflage and deception operations, particularly in the technical development of dummy equipment. His theatrical background had provided useful insights into how to create convincing illusions. But he had been one specialist among many in a complex organization, and his personal role had been systematically exaggerated. Perhaps appropriately for a magician, he'd performed his greatest illusion after the war by making his own contributions appear larger than they were. By the 1980s, with the full scope of Allied deception operations declassified, military historians could assess El Alamein's deception campaign in proper context. The consensus that emerged was nuanced. Operation Bertram had been a significant tactical success that contributed meaningfully to British victory, but it had operated within a larger framework of material superiority, improved British tactics, and German strategic overextension. The dummy tanks hadn't won the battle by themselves, but they had helped ensure that when Montgomery struck, he struck with overwhelming force at precisely the point where Rommel was least prepared to resist. The final accounting of Operation Bertram's effectiveness came from an unexpected source. In 1982, a German military historian, Dr. Karl-Heinz Frieser, published an analysis based on newly available Wehrmacht documents. His research revealed that German situation maps from October 22, 1942, the day before Montgomery's attack, showed British armor concentrations almost exactly where Bertram had intended German intelligence to see them: strong forces in the south near Heimamat, modest forces in the north near Tel El Isa. The real distribution was nearly reversed. The deception, as far as could be determined from documentary evidence, had worked completely. 50 dummy tanks, positioned correctly and maintained properly, had convinced German intelligence they were seeing 150 real ones. Those phantom formations had frozen an entire panzer division in position during the critical hours when its intervention might have blunted Montgomery's assault. The return on investment, measured in time bought, casualties prevented, and strategic advantage gained, was incalculable. The toy army had earned its place in history, not despite being made of canvas and paint, but precisely because it had understood something fundamental about warfare, that battles are fought in minds before they're fought on ground, and that the side that controls perception often controls reality. War, at its essence, is a contest of wills mediated through violence. But the history of El Alamein's deception reminds us that violence isn't the only medium through which will can be imposed. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that never fires, the tank that exists only as shadow and canvas, the division that lives only in the enemy's fear and miscalculation. Jasper Maskelyne understood what military theorists had long known but often forgot: that human perception is vulnerable, that expectations create blind spots, that seeing is not the same as knowing. His conjurer's training had taught him that audiences see what they expect to see, and that a skilled illusionist doesn't fight those expectations but exploits them. The same principle applied to Rommel's intelligence officers, analyzing reconnaissance photographs through the lens of their own doctrinal assumptions, seeing British armor exactly where German planning manuals suggested it should be. The legacy of the Phantom Division extends beyond tactics into the realm of philosophy. Operation Bertram proved that in warfare, as in theater, reality is negotiable. The same desert existed for both sides, but they perceived different versions of it, one true, one carefully constructed. For crucial days in October 1942, the constructed version proved more operationally real than the truth, because it shaped decisions and movements that determined where steel met flesh. There's a final irony in Maskelyne's story. The magician who spent the war making tanks appear and disappear performed his last trick on himself, vanishing from official histories even as he tried to claim center stage. Perhaps that's fitting. The best illusions, after all, are the ones where the audience never quite figures out how the trick was done, where the machinery remains hidden and only the effect remains visible. In the end, the The dummy tanks at El Alamein teach a lesson that transcends their specific tactical application. That imagination, properly applied, can be as powerful as industry. That deception, when executed with precision and psychological insight, can multiply force far beyond the mathematics of metal and explosives. The Phantom Division didn't win the war, but it helped ensure that when the real steel rolled forward, it rolled over an enemy who was looking the wrong direction. And sometimes, in war as in magic, looking the wrong direction is all it takes.